All right, ring ring. It's time for another episode of Crossplay Conversations, the show where we dive deep into the world of video games while keeping it light. I'm your host, Luke Lewis, and this week I'm joined by my co-host, the sneaker savant, Joseph Hooper.
What up?
How you doing?
Recovering from a cold, a flu, whatever, but indie games are empowering me right now. It's like
Indie games are alive and well, so
yeah,
it's healing the world, I
it's
think,
like my nerd
especially after.
steroid right now.
Hell yeah, I love to hear it. Good to see ya. Good to be back on the pod. It's been a hot minute since we recorded together because we pre-recorded some
Yeah,
stuff and you were traveling, and we don't have the Wii U Wonder Kid Jacob today. He's taking a little content break after a slew of lots of podcasts and packs and everything. But
hmm
yeah, I'm excited to do a little duo pod. We're talking about a topic today that's near and dear to both of our hearts. We're gonna dig into open-ended game design and kind of explore what makes a game open-ended, what we like about that subgenre or style of game, some recent examples in the AAA and indie space, and kind of pick it apart a little bit and just talk about kind of the state of open world game, or not even just specifically open world, but open-ended game design. So it can be interpreted in multiple ways. But let's kick off things with our icebreaker question. I'm curious, what features make a game feel open-ended, and how do they differ from a linear experience for you, just to set the tone for what we're digging into today?
yeah. I would say whenever a game takes away traditional, um, I guess, signposting tools or traditional game design logic in how they build, I guess, the product. I think that leads to it being more open ended, meaning like, I think just not having a tutorial is one
Mm-hmm.
small, very, very small aspect of how you start opening a game up and letting the player discover things from themselves. Another aspect is, of course, an open world where you let the player explore and choose where they want to go. So I feel like the more you take away those traditional barriers that were put in place early on in video game development to guide the player and teach the player certain patterns and stuff so they know how to play your game. The more you take away small little pieces of that, the more you're going to end up with this open experience. And there are more games that we'll talk about later in the podcast that I'll kind of double back and add this to, but that's kind of my thought. What about you?
Totally. Yeah, it's interesting that you jump straight to like signposting and tutorials. When I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking specifically like the way you approach the game as the player, in terms of like, you can go in multiple directions. If it's a narrative experience, you can have differing experiences than other folks who are playing the game. If it's a puzzle experience, there's multiple ways to solve something, or the order in which you're tackling puzzles doesn't have to be level 1 to level 2. You can kind of mix and match how you want. But yeah, I think the tutorial specifically is a key part, because I think a lot of the games that we'll be highlighting today are very self-directed, for better or for worse in some cases. And I think there's a reason we're doing this episode without our co-host Jacob, because I think he's highlighted titles in the past that I don't want to speak for him, but I know he's found a little more frustrating than fun because of the open-ended nature. So it's kind of interesting how like um, this type of game or this style of game design can resonate differently with folks.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned like the narrative openness as well, because even that kind of ties back to what I was saying in terms of like, if you think of your really traditional video game, it is, hey, we're here to tell you a story. Like
Mm-hmm.
every step of the way, we're telling you our story. And I do think at some certain point in video games, there was the idea of, hey, what if you just tell your own story? Like even looking at what is the game by like Zhao Zum CRPG Disco
Oh,
Elysium.
oh
Disco
yeah.
Elysium.
Mm-hmm.
Like where heavy on the story, but it's like so
Sure.
open where it's like, what even is the story that I'm trying
Right.
to be getting from this experience? So yeah, the more you remove those like very, very traditional game design patterns, I feel like the more games become open. most of the time.
Heck yeah. Let's jump into the main topic within this framework and talk about what we enjoy about this style of game specifically, and start throwing out some examples of favorite games within this space that represent open-ended game design. What comes to mind for you?
So I guess to answer the first half, like what do I enjoy about these types of
For sure.
games? I like feeling like I need to learn the world of the game, or I need to learn something to be able to approach this game and like really get my feet under it. Like, of course, I love games that have your like standard tutorial that walk you through a story, but there's something about being plopped into a world or a situation and not really understanding how the game mechanics are going to further my progress within the game. I think we have Outer Wilds on our list here as like a perfect indie example of this, where you drop in, they teach you all these different mechanics, but then you're kind of just like, okay, what do I do with this? Like, what is the objective? And I love that's the opening challenge of the game. Like, it's not like, hey, go here, do this, fight this. It's like, hey, this is the world we built. Take some time to learn it, explore it, and then it should become apparent what you need to do, which is very cool.
Definitely. I think I felt similarly about Tunic in that way, of like the way it doles out information to the player, and specifically with like the in-game instruction manual that um you're getting new information over time, and the layers are being revealed, and I think that's a really satisfying way to do open-ended game design as well.
Yeah, and I guess to just jump off of that and
Yeah.
dig deeper, like Tunic is one of my favorite games because of that very reason, where like in contrast to what I said earlier, or maybe it fits in, but Tunic is not open in the terms that like, oh, you can kind of do whatever you want. It's like there are a set of rules, you just need to learn them yourself. And over time, you learn more and more and more just by experiencing the game. There are some things and features that are available to you from the very start of the game if you knew what button combinations or what things to interact with in the world, that it may take you hours to find just because of that learning process and the fact that the game doesn't really hold your hand. Like, I really love Tunic for that exact reason, where you're just dropped in this Zelda Fox world, and it's just like, okay, learn the world. Here's a random language. This is our language. You can't read it. Just mess around and like start to understand this world that we've built. And I think, yeah, Tunic is probably the perfect example of that, at least on the indie side for sure.
Heck yeah. I think too, I really love the element of talking to other people as you're playing open-ended games, and I think that's like one of the most satisfying things for me, is like you're saying, like uncovering that mystery of like what the heck is going on in this game, and then talking to you or other friends that are playing the same game but having potentially different experiences or approaching things differently. And I just think that's really cool and really like wholly unique to these games, and it's really satisfying to jump into an open-ended game like Tunic and not have any idea what's going on. And I think there's something really satisfying about that, where like I'm trying to think of a recent example where it's like this game is a known quantity but it's still fun.
Final Fantasy.
Sure, yeah, where it's like I, it's amazing, I love the game, but I knew what I was getting into in terms of like
Right.
structure and combat and narrative, and the tutorials are to be expected, and they're teaching me the combat system, and then I'm in the world, and then we're going on an adventure. But I think
Right.
there's something really cool about like a complete unknown experience, which there's a lot of examples recently in the indie scene that we mentioned, but in the AAA space too, where games like Elden Ring, where it's like taking a well-established genre of the Souls like and doing something different with it, and I think speaking to a wider variety of players in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because I think that's another reason why uh, now I kind of gravitate more to these open-ended games is if you, or at least if I think back to like my early gaming days when I was a kid, and I pulled up a Ratchet and Clank game or a Jack and Daxter game or whatever. I don't
Sure.
know why I said Jack and Daxter. I'm going to be honest. I have never played through a Jack and Daxter game, but like Ratchet and Clank, you boot that up and you 100% know what you're going to get.
Hmm.
Um, for most of the games back in the day, like you saw the trailer, you knew what you were going to get, right? So, like being trained on those types of games for so many decades up till this point, where you're now pulling out games like Elden Ring and Tunic and stuff, and it basically changes everything you know about game design that has like been ingrained in you over the past, hundreds of games or, you know, tens of years, right? So like I love booting up a game and just being completely lost because I feel like after playing so many games, you do kind of get in that rhythm where if it is a game like Final Fantasy or even Jedi Survivor or some of these more common games, like it really isn't enough to just have the typical game design. Like the game has to go above and beyond to make you feel, I don't know, amazed, enthused, or whatever while you're playing it. Whereas
Sure.
it's very exciting to start the game, feel completely lost, feel like you're in a completely new experience from the jump, and it's like, okay, we're already starting off from a high place because I have no idea what's around the next corner.
Totally. And I think too, an element that I was thinking about recently is like all of these games, especially as a kid, it was about like bang for your buck for me of like you're picking these up a couple games a year, birthdays and Christmases, you're prioritizing like what's going to get me the most playtime. And I think that's become less of a thing as I've gotten older because just have less free time to game. And so when I hear games 4 to 6 hours, I'm stoked. But there is something really special about an Elden Ring, a Tears of the Kingdom, a Dragon's Dogma 2 more recently that you could play for dozens and dozens of hours and not uncover every secret, not explore everything, talk to friends and find new things to uncover 50 hours in. Like I do think that there's something special to be said for that that's really compelling in its own right.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess to jump back to something you said a minute ago,
Sure.
when you have those water cooler moments, do you have anything in the back of your head or any games in particular where you're like, wait, what? Like where you were talking to someone about the game and you're like, oh yeah, like X, Y, and Z, and then you're like, wait, what? Like what happened? Like, are you telling me you saw this? Like I didn't see that at all. Do you have any of those games that stick out to you as being those kind of magical experiences?
Sure. I think most recently Tears of the Kingdom is probably the biggest one of just chatting with friends, having moments where like I remember early on talking to a friend, this might have been you, I'm not sure if it was somebody else, but they were talking about exploring the depths and I haven't even discovered the depths and I was like, "Where are you?" And they're like, "In the depths, like down." And I remember like jumping into that hole and being
Yeah.
like, "I'm gonna die. This is insane. What is going on?" And then you like find the light plants and start to uncover everything. And then I spent like 25 hours just running around the depths doing all kinds of stuff and like little moments like that. Or um and this is a more linear game, but I think this example still works with God of War Ragnarok, where I remember podcasting and doing our spoiler cast with you and Arsene on player, and you mentioned like in one of the levels there was basically an entire world you could uncover if you went through the specific side quest. Like little things like that blow my mind, where it drastically changes your perception of the game and deeply affects like how you experience the game. And the fact that like you could miss that, I think to some folks that's like, oh, I don't want to miss what's important, I want the game to tell me what's important. I think it's like it's really cool to have those unique experiences that like feel really personal, but then I can share it with folks in conversation and then it can become more of a shared experience, which I love all of that so much.
Right, right. Yeah, I think most recently is probably Baldur's Gate 3, which I'm sure we'll talk about a
Oh
little
yeah.
later. But um, another one is The Witcher 3.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember specifically, like I don't know who I was talking to, or maybe I was looking online or something. And like the most impactful quests for me in that game, and maybe one of the most impactful quests for me of all time, was like that Bloody Baron quest,
Yeah,
where
such a good
that
quest.
was kind of like, and the Witcher 3 doesn't seem like that much of an open-ended game. It doesn't feel like your choices are affecting the world that much. It does definitely feels like a traditional RPG where they're giving you a choice and you pick something, but it might not, totally change a ton of things, right? So
Hmm.
to do this Bloody Baron quest and have such a bizarre and like unbelievable outcome, and just being like, wow, that was incredible. Like, this was insane. And then talking to someone else who are like, oh, yeah, I did this different thing. And so this evil spirit ended up like, getting cut loose and stuff, X, Y, and Z. I'm just like, I had no, like, a quest that was so impactful to me had a completely different, could have had a completely different outcome if I just made one different decision. I was like, oh man, this is super awesome. And another one I think is Fallout, where I think
Yeah,
the super water cooler moment was like, hey, yeah, I nuked Nuketown or whatever. Not Nuketown, that's from Call of Duty, but Megaton.
there you go.
Um,
Yeah.
where you're like, yeah, I set the nuke off, and you're like, you did like you set the nuke off? Like, what does that even mean? And they're like, yeah, it's just like a crater now. And I'm like, that's insane. Like, that's just wild to me.
I remember that one in particular had like I think I was we were chatting on we did a Fallout spoiler cast on Lukewarm Games based on the show, and I was talking about how I played Fallout 3 I think somewhere in middle school, and coming to like middle school lunch table and someone said they nuked Megaton, and I was like, but how are you going to finish the game? Like, it like broke my brain and that sort of thing. And so then I had to like make a new save file, play up to that point, do it so that I could see what the heck was going on, because I didn't want to mess up my base game. But yeah, fucking wild. That's so cool.
Yes, very much so.
Doubling back to Witcher for a second though too, that one's interesting to me because I think that's still maybe to this day the most overwhelmed I've ever felt in a game, in a sense of like so many side quests, the map was so expansive, it felt like I could never see everything. And I think the way it like, because like Elden Ring is very expansive as well, but I feel like the way Elden Ring like presents it in the UI and whatnot isn't as like sensory overload personally. And so I never finished Witcher 3, and I don't think I ever got close to finishing Witcher 3 because it just felt so intimidating, and it just felt like this crazy laundry list of quests. So it's interesting kind of, I think there can be, I'm not going to say Witcher 3 is bloated because I think to each their own. Like me personally, it just didn't resonate as much with me, but like it is interesting how sometimes maybe these games can go too far in one direction in terms of not guiding players or giving them too much to do or etc.
Totally. I think that is a key complaint with Baldur's Gate 3, where uh, Act Acts 1 and 2 there is a ton of content to do in Acts 1 and 2, but the way the maps are laid out, that it's like every piece of content has its own little siloed area where it's like, oh, one or two things are going to be in this area of the map, one or two things are going to be in that area of the map. Uh, Act 3, I won't get into details on like what is happening there or anything, but Act 3 is very much the first time in the game where it is sensory overload, where um, it is like you're in the area and you're like, I have no clue what to do, because there's everything that's kind of just coming at your face. And I'm just gonna keep moving over the fact that I said, anyways,
You're good.
um, like, it's just like, I think a lot of people drop off because of that reason, because it's just so much in terms of sensory overload. And I remember, to your point about Elden Ring, that was a key point about people like trolling, I don't know, Ubisoft or EA or whatever, about their typical maps in these open world games, where it is like arrow here, little beacon in the distance, whereas Elden Ring
Mm-hmm.
is just kind of a clean map. It's like, hey, you haven't discovered anything, so go find it. Like, we're not giving you any markers, we're not giving you any landmarks. It's just kind of like,
Yeah.
here's a traditional paper map pretty much, and you need to go and uncover things on your own.
Yeah, that segues into nicely talking about kind of the evolution of open-ended games, and I think that's one of my favorite things that's come out over the years is the idea of like uncovering the map as you go rather than like having all the information at the jump, kind of the Ubisoft model. Even though they've kind of steered away for that. I was playing Assassin's Creed Mirage a couple weeks ago. Had a day off, was sitting on a copy I got for Christmas, and I checked it out, and yeah, it's wild to play that juxtaposed with an Elden Ring or Tears of the Kingdom and just see how they approach it differently in a sense that like they're both open world experiences, but one feels like substantially more like interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely think that although the typical Assassin's Creed games are open ended, the typical Ubisoft games are technically open ended in terms of you can go and do what you want. And I don't even know if I would consider that open ended as more so as just like open world.
Sure.
But I think that there isn't really much wonder or intrigue in those types of games because they are telling you upfront what you're going to get. Like if you go to this landmark, you're going to get this specific type of activity.
Hmm.
If you go over here, you'll fight this specific type of enemy. So like even though it is open world, like we've been trained over the years to know, okay, like this game has, you know, 5 different activities, you know, 3 different enemy encounter types or whatever. And once I spend 5 hours in the game, I can kind of tell what the next 50 hours are going to be. Whereas Elden Ring, there was nothing like that, right? Every encounter was unique because it was like, okay, sure, this encounter had this type of boss or you had this kind of dungeon, but when you go over to this corner of the map, who knows? It could be something 100% completely different, right? So I think a big part of like my enjoyment for that those open world or open ended type games is like the game keeping me on my feet, like the game keeping me on my toes in terms of like you never know the game's next move to to keep it sweet.
Yeah, totally. And that element of like self discovery, I think, is key to your point too. Because, yeah, open world doesn't by default make a game open ended. And I think, like, open world, sure, you're choosing if you're going to mission number two or mission number four, but it's not the same, like, pace. I think pacing too is an important thing to highlight within this, like, style of games. Because I was thinking about like we mentioned Final Fantasy Rebirth earlier and how that game really kind of I think that I really like the game and I'm sure we'll talk about it on a future pod, but the pacing is a little wonky in my opinion in a sense that like you do a giant birth of story content, missions, narrative, very focused. And then it's like, okay, go do side quests for 4 hours before you leave this area if you want to see and do everything.
Yep.
And I don't love that like the way that's trickled out personally, but I think I look at games like Tears of the Kingdom where the self direction and the open endedness kind of leaves me to have like the perfect pacing experience I want. Like if I want to have an evening where I'm just aimlessly wandering and discovering stuff and finding shrines, I can do that. But if I want to like mainline towards that temple or that objective that I know is going to get me some story, I can do that as well. And so I think that level of choice where it's like both things are equally compelling is also kind of key to it as well.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a balancing act. And I think for me, to like rephrase or you know kind of jump off what you said is like for me when I'm playing these types of games, I think I'm looking for almost every event in the game to have some sort of similar weight to them. Like I would love a main story event to have a somewhat of a similar weight to some sort of side content. And I think that's hard. It's never going to be one to one, but like you're saying, there is a definite, you know, like disparity between a Final Fantasy main event where you're fighting this crazy boss and it's super bombastic to a random side mission where you're fighting a couple enemies and you know doing some side task. Whereas if you look at Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, yes, once again the main story missions, especially towards the end, are very like epic and grandiose, but at the same time, when you do stumble upon some of these side missions, they can kind of unfold into these, oh, wow, this is like way bigger and way more magical than I expected type of event. And I love never knowing, like, whenever you roll up upon some, location or landmark, never knowing what type of, event you're going to get when you
Totally.
do that. And I think that is another reason, like the Elden Ring thing, where it's like the side missions, some of the like side bosses, and I mean, look at Melania as the perfect example. Melania is side content, yet it's one of the most epic experiences in the game because it's such a tough battle, and the way to find Melania, you have to go through all these hoops to just get to her location. Uh, that stuff is incredible, where it just
Yeah,
feels like you are in this world and you are exploring the world, and it doesn't necessarily feel like the game designers are holding your hand and saying, hey, look, this is the main content we made, really look at this stuff, and you can kind of look
sure.
at this stuff if you want. It's like, this is just the world we built. Like, please enjoy it at your own pace, and in the order that you would like.
Totally. There's also a level of like approachability to it as well, where like I've played a lot of Souls games. I haven't beaten any Souls games, but I always dabble. But I made it the furthest in any of them that I did in Elden Ring. And I think that's because of the open ended nature of like, if there was a boss that was just kicking my ass, I could respawn, turn around, walk the complete opposite direction, and find something else compelling to do or explore. Or, I went down south and found an area where I could farm XP and kind of level up my character more, and just had more options. And I felt similar ways about Zelda and these other games that we've mentioned, where it's nice to be able to like be challenged if you want, but also in a linear experience you can get stuck on a boss or stuck on a puzzle, and then it's like, well, I guess I can't progress further today. But it's like, I like the open-ended nature, kind of allowing you to play more if you want to experience something different.
Right. 100%. I think really the grandfather of open-ended games is, I think you look at Metroidvania or
Mm.
Metroid or
Hmm.
Castlevania, where obviously those games are the, hey, you explore, and to an extent they do put up barriers and say, hey, you can't go any further until you have this weapon or this item or whatever. Which is, kind of like open ended with like training wheels on it, where it's like you can explore and look around to an extent, but ultimately you are going to have to go where we need you to go before you can see the rest of the content, which is totally fine. Uh, but I like how games have now built on top of that framework and learned to abstract like those telltale signs of this being like a very clear Metroidvania or X, Y, and Z. And I think like a perfect example of that is like Hollow Knight, where Hollow
Yeah,
Knight, for the most part, feels like you are kind of just wandering through this underground world, and you're just like discovering these areas and um, kind of learning as you go. Where like in I haven't played Hollow Knight in a long time, so I might be wrong, and maybe Silk Song will feel much different and way better than the original Hollow Knight. But I don't recall in Hollow Knight ever really feeling like, oh, hey, yeah, I'm clearly hard locked here. I always felt like there was somewhere else to go and something else to discover, right? You'll obviously see a little door or like a little area where you're like, oh, I can't really jump that high yet. Like, obviously I have to come back. But it never feels like the game is like throwing up a big X here. It's just like, oh, okay,
totally.
this is the end of this path. Like, go back somewhere else. Um, so I think really like in terms of the adventure games, Metroidvanias are like, and Zelda, to be frank, like Metroidvanias and Zelda like games are kind of like the grandfathers. But I do like how we've evolved over time to this point where it's like, yeah, this is a Metroidvania, but the game is so abstract that you don't even know where the game is trying to lead you at any given moment.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you brought up Hollow Knight too, because I'm curious, do you see a big difference between an open ended indie versus an open ended AAA? Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so I think AAA games have the luxury of playing it a lot safer with how they design the games because they can make up for that in breadth of content. And I think Elden Ring is a bad example because Elden Ring, I think, does both very well. I think the game design is very innovative, and obviously there's a lot of content. But I do think that indies only have, obviously they have a smaller budget, but they also have a smaller window to hook the player and convince the player that their game is worth playing, right? So I think a lot of times when I play indies, I'm given a more unexpected experience right from the jump. And a perfect example of this is Animal Well, which I won't spoil the game. I don't even know if it's really a spoilable game, but I've been playing Well recently. And from the very beginning, Animal Well is like, I don't know, walk around, look around, just keep looking around. And like, that's kind of what I think is the theme of Animal Well, where it's just like every time you do something, the game is just like, I don't know, man, just keep looking around. Just keep looking around. Even when you achieve something, it's like, all right, you got it. Now just keep looking around. And I love that about the game where it's just like, when I think of like AAA games, it's kind of like, all right, here is the objective, or here is the setup. Here's this big, overall theme of the game. And like, now we're going to help you tackle this in one way or another. And I think that's really cool and awesome. Animal Well is like, I don't, who knows? I don't know what this game is. You don't know what this game is. Just look around. And I think that's very cool. And another game, like, I wouldn't call Inscription as an open ended game,
Hmm.
but it is open in the terms of like, you don't necessarily know what you need to do to proceed. Like Inscription, you're obviously playing cards, but then you get up from the table and you start looking around the room and you're like what is going on here? So I love that indie games really take risks in terms of, hey, especially from the start, we're going to kind of throw you out there without any safety net or safety vest. Um, but I also like that they are taking more risks on how they approach their game design because they kind of have to.
Totally. For whatever reason, when I think open ended games in the indie space, I gravitate towards a lot of puzzle focused stuff. I was thinking about, we mentioned Tunic, we mentioned Outer Wilds to an extent, and then I was also thinking about The Witness and games like Fez, where there are always multiple things to do. There's always multiple ways to approach scenarios. The way information is doled out to you is, revealed over time throughout this mystery. But it's interesting when I think about like open world, or I'm sorry, AAA versus indie, I think about like sense of scale. But some of those puzzle games we mentioned, I feel like have a crazy grand sense of scale in terms of like the way they reveal solutions over time, but while keeping it approachable in a sense that it's like you have everything you need to solve this puzzle. Maybe you don't know it right now, but you will over time, and kind of discovering that in an organic way, I think is really compelling. And the point you mentioned about Animal Well being like, here's the information, here's what you need. Like, I think that's really, really kind of what sets it apart for me. But to your point, I think AAA can do that as well. But I'm seeing a lot of interesting examples in the indie space, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think that's a very astute observation because at sometimes I do think that AAA games, because they have more to lose, they are sometimes afraid of challenging the players, especially in the puzzle aspect, because like we all know that one of the most high friction experiences in a game outside of like some skill based challenge like in the Souls games is puzzles, right? Like if your puzzle is too hard, people will just walk away and not go back to the game. They'll just be like, oh, I couldn't get past this, so I'm just done playing this for however long. And I think AAA games want to avoid that as much as possible, right? You want people to spend time in your game. You don't want people dropping it. So I do feel like sometimes they play to like the lowest common denominator of like, okay, maybe there's a 7-year old who's going to play this game, so we don't want to make it too abstract, especially when there's a lot of money and a lot of content that you're hoping the player gets to, which I think is a bit of a bummer. I think a lot of the indie games, how they incorporate puzzles into their game is very exciting and is why I end up loving a lot of them because at their core, I wouldn't call a lot of them puzzle games. Like I wouldn't call Tunic like Tunic has a lot of puzzles in it, but I wouldn't necessarily
Sure.
describe it as a puzzle game. Like it's just a Zelda like that has a lot of puzzle heavy elements. Um and I mean even Outer Wilds, it is very much a puzzle game more than anything, but at its core, I don't even feel like it doesn't feel like I'm solving
I don't feel like that's how I'd pitch it to
puzzles,
somebody
right?
if I was like, "You should play Outer Wilds." I wouldn't say it's a puzzle game. I'd say it's like
Right.
an adventure experience with
Right.
puzzle elements, I guess, is a better descriptor.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's a big thing. I really do feel like the AAA space has lost like its um I guess hunger to build cool puzzles in games. Like I really feel like if I'm raking my brain, the last game that had really incredible puzzles in it at a AAA level was Portal 2. Like I'm
Mm.
trying to think of other like can you think of any other puzzle games or AAA games that had heavy
I'm
puzzle
a big
elements?
proponent of the Zelda shrines in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom.
Yeah.
Like, I think Tears of the Kingdom specifically was like that one felt really cool. Like seeing clips online of folks solving shrines in completely different ways and using Ultra Hand to build different things, and
Right.
the viral clip of somebody making a skateboard and like grinding on rails, like all of that stuff where it's like, oh, I didn't even think to do that, or like making a hot air balloon, I didn't even think to do that, or little things, or maybe I tried to make a monster truck to ride down the mountain or that sort of thing. So I think like that's that's probably the most like I was thinking about this idea of like I think a friend mentioned when Tears of the Kingdom came out, like imagine that being your first game or your first Zelda game or your first like
Yeah.
you get a Switch and that's the game you get and you're 10 years old. It kind of breaks every other game for you in a sense that like this open-ended experience where you're solving puzzles however you see fit, you're building vehicles, you're literally phasing through the game world. How do you play another game after that?
Yeah, very true. That's a good point. Tears of the Kingdom is definitely, I would say, a great example of a AAA game that is really trying to challenge the player and make them think. Um, and I'd be remiss. We're talking about open-ended games. Uh, we have to talk about Prey, Dishonored. I feel like
Yeah,
those
for real though.
at the time, they were probably AA games, like at best. They were obviously weren't indie, but I do think they were in that AA space. But those are perfect games of like, hey, like it is a little bit linear in terms of hey, there's levels, but it is kind of like approach this how you want. It's an immersive sim, um, which I absolutely loved because something else we haven't really talked about, but I think the open ended game design allows you to feel like you're playing a better you're playing your role of your character more. Like
Yeah.
when I am able to test out things like you're saying in Tears of the Kingdom, or take a different route or a specific approach in Dishonored, I do feel like I can embody that character more because as I am thinking up solutions to problems, I am not thinking up solutions that obviously the game wants me to think of these solutions, but I'm not thinking of the game solution. I'm thinking of my own solution, and it just happens to work in the context of the game, which I think is very cool. I think like there is and let me know if you've ever had this feeling where there's a difference between you're playing a game and you approach a challenge or an enemy or whatever, and you see that enemy and you're like, I clearly know what they want me to do. They want me to do this. They want me to do that to get the thing or hit the weak point. And it's just kind of like, okay, like I know games. I know how you design this game. I know exactly what you want me to do. It's very clear. Versus you get to a puzzle in like sort of a tunic or something, and you're like, like, what is that? Like, I don't even know what that is, let alone what I need to do. And when you finally figure it out, and you're like, oh no way, maybe if I try this, you feel like, oh, I thought of an idea on my own. I thought to try it, and it worked. And I think Zelda is the perfect example where you're like, oh yeah, like I tried to make an ice floating platform to get across this river and it worked. That is incredible. Like I feel like I am building solutions in this world as opposed to just doing whatever the game wants me to do.
Yeah, totally. I think that's what separates all of these games we're talking about for me of, you know, I'm going to open a door using a classic block puzzle. I got to move this block over here and put it on the button and it'll open the door versus like what we're talking about with I think Zelda is the best example recently where like it was like I think to Zelda's point or to your point about like I think I know what the game designers want me to do. I feel like I had that moment in Zelda, but I was like, what if I try to do this absurd thing? What if I connect 18 boards across this giant chasm and make the stupidest, ricketiest bridge? Oh, it
Yeah,
worked. Like the satisfaction in those moments. But I also think in games like Tunic, like Outer Wilds, like The Witness, where I think it's really impressive where a game can make you feel smart and make you feel empowered and have that moment where you solve a puzzle and you're like, wow, that was really unique, or I felt like I had an active role in that.
100%. And another aspect of like, letting the player come out with their own solutions, I like when you do that, you also have to account for what the player is going to do so that you can, like, if they do a certain thing, you can prepare for that and, make sure the game reacts accordingly to that. And I love when games incorporate that and you're just like, oh wow, like this game has everything figured out. And I think the perfect example is like Elden Ring, where obviously you can explore any different way. And as a result of that, uh, they do a good job of connecting the map within itself, right? So you explore this area far in the top left of the map, and then you jump in some coffin. The coffin teleports you to the far right of the map, and you're just like, well, how did I end up over here? So I love when the game feels like it has no walls, right? Like it just feels like, okay, I keep going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And eventually I just get, looped back around on this other area of the map. And then I can go deep over here and like just keep looping. And it keeps kind of like Ouroborosing on itself, where it's just like, oh, it's just like never ending. The world is like fully well thought, where it's all connected. All the abilities, especially when you get a like Metroidvania ability, that it's like, oh, now that I have this ability, I could have went this other way first, but now that I have this other ability, it makes it easier to do this other section type deal. I love that stuff. Um, so I don't think that's easy to do. Like you have to constantly think about every single thing a player could do at any given moment, and to like prepare for that and make sure the game is designed to handle that and not break the experience is
Totally.
pretty incredible.
I think that's too why I keep going back to Tears of the Kingdom of like as like such a marvel in game design in a sense that like there's so many mechanics in that game that shouldn't work and that should break the game and that should cause issues, but the fact that it doesn't and it holds up and you can do all kinds of wild and crazy and creative things, I think is really a testament to that experience. And I haven't played Baldur's Gate, but just like based on talking to you and talking to other folks, like the open-ended nature from a narrative perspective in that game just sounds really really compelling in a sense that like you're talking to different people and those choices are impacting like true branching path narrative that I haven't seen since like probably the Mass Effect games in a meaningful way to that extent.
Yeah, 100%. I think Baldur's Gate is really like, especially from a narrative perspective, I've never seen anything even come remotely close to like the experiences in Baldur's Gate, where um, like it is referencing events that took place hours and hours ago in like a previous act. And those events are impacting the story now. And like every little step you make, like impacts every future decision, right? Like I haven't finished the game, but I remember the last moment of the game was I lost, not permanently, but I lost a character in my camp, some character that I heavily depended on. And I was like, I'm like, this is wild. Like, I couldn't tell if they took this character every time or if they took this character because I used them a lot, or I couldn't tell. Like, because essentially what happened was I was trying out different party combinations, and I was like, I don't really like this combination. I'm gonna go get this other character. And as I went to go get the character uh, got removed from my party. So then I was talking
Damn.
to a friend, and they were like, "Oh yeah, like I had a completely different character that I didn't use get taken, and yeah, so this is how it affected my run." I'm like, that is wild. That like the game, I don't know how it picks how these characters get taken or how it chooses to do certain things, but it's just crazy how many different potential outcomes can happen. And then as a result of the outcome, it affects how you play the game. So it's just kind of like a cascading type experience, which is kind of unbelievable.
Yeah, that's crazy. I think too, like obviously we're not game devs and we don't know what it takes to like make these things happen, but you have to imagine it's more complicated to make a branching path narrative akin to Baldur's Gate versus like a more straightforward experience. But
Mhm.
the results speak for themselves in terms of like what is really, really compelling about these types of games. I'm curious within this style of game design, do you have a game in mind that you would recommend as like the definitive, like everyone should experience this open-ended game? If you're unsure about being overwhelmed by an open-ended experience, like play this one, this is the game to stand by.
Yeah, I would say for people who have played video games for a while, uh, my recommendation, without a doubt, would be Tunic. I feel like Tunic is such an homage to video games in itself, um, and like the way it is designed to teach you and to keep the mystery and all that stuff is just like unbelievable. Like it is still like it is a game that I will remember for forever. Um, and I have one other game, but I'm curious what you're gonna say. So I'm going to pass it to you.
I feel like I have like sub branching options for folks depending
Okay.
on what you like. I think Tears of the Kingdom for me is the most universal. Though that said, Jacob, I know you're probably listening to this and you're like, no, it's not. I didn't like it. I get it that it doesn't work for some people, but I think for the most part, in terms of an all ages selection, like that's a great game to try. That's a great game to have it be your first big open-ended experience, because I just think the way you can approach it however you want, but there's also like more conventional ways to play it as well, make it a nice choice. But I think on the indie side, I do gravitate towards the puzzle titles. I'd love to throw out Outer Wilds in addition to your pick with Tunic, of just cool experiences that can't be done in any other medium, that have an element of open-endedness and branching path nature to it all.
Yeah, I think that was going to be the other one I said is Outer Wilds is like it definitely like it is open almost to a fault at the beginning where you're like I know a lot of people bounce off of it in the beginning because you're just like I don't know what this is, I don't know what I
I don't
need to
know if
do.
this revokes my gamer card, but I've technically never finished it, and I
That's fine.
hate myself for it. But
That's fine.
I've dabbled, and it's really freaking cool, and I love the music. So that's kind of a, I guess, odd one
And
for me to recommend. But I do think it's that interesting that folks definitely should play it.
yeah, I mean, it does not surprise me at all that you bounced off of it because it is open to a fault, like I said. But as
Wasn't a
you
quality
start
thing,
to
it's just time.
just
But
like,
yeah,
oh, okay, okay, but yeah, like this one, I feel like I kind of judge them based off of how satisfied you are by the end. Like you're lost at the beginning, and then like the level of satisfaction you get by understanding what things are at the end. I feel like Tunic and Outer Wilds are probably two of the highest, and then
totally.
obviously if you're not afraid of somewhat of a challenge, Elden Ring is like kind of like the go-to
Yeah,
granddaddy of open-ended games where you will never believe all the things that you will come across. Like your jaw will constantly be on the floor.
Yeah, and I would say, like, we're getting Elden Ring DLC later this year, and I would say if you're at all on the fence, if you think it's interesting, if you're up for a bit of a challenge, but have never really dabbled with a Souls game, I do think Elden Ring is it fair to say it's the most approachable Souls game? Kind
Yes, I would
of.
say so.
I
I would
I
say
for
so.
me personally, I would say that just because you can't the open world nature of it, I think makes it less frustrating in a sense that you have multiple things you could do and you're not just stuck on one boss unless you
Yep.
want to be.
Stuck.
Nice. One
Yep.
game I didn't talk about on this episode, but I do want to briefly mention. I've been playing a bit of Dragon's Dogma 2, which came out recently. What a weird, interesting use of open-ended game design. I feel like the economy in that game is wild. Everything's really expensive. Um, it's really like scary is the wrong word, but like everything matters in a sense of like if you go out on an adventure, you can die, you can lose money, it's challenging. And then the pawn system that they use in the game, where you can create a companion character that then goes on their own adventures and comes back to you and like has all this world knowledge that as you're exploring gives you information of like, oh, I was here yesterday with so and so and this happened, and it's like all like interconnected into the game. Like it's really campy. It's not the most polished experience, but it's just like it's a really interesting game that makes me excited about open-ended games and just like what they can do. And yeah, I got to give it to Capcom for just being on kind of a streak of just either making really polished known experiences with like the Resident Evil remakes or Street Fighter 6, but then like going out on a whim with an old cult classic with Dragon's Dogma and bringing it back in a big way. It'll definitely be in conversation for me when it comes to game of the year, because it's just like a very unique experience within the space.
Nice.
Closing things out here, do you have any game series that you feel like would benefit from being more open ended, that you feel like right now is kind of rooted in the linear space?
Let me think. Let me think. Do you have one off the top of your head while I'm thinking?
I don't have like I think about games that like I really love and adore, like say Marvel Spider-Man 2 last generation, where really enjoy the story, I really enjoy the side quests, and I wonder if like the next evolution of that type of game is more open-ended in a sense, and I don't know really what that would look like. Maybe it's like how you uncover side quests or how you discover new areas, or like if they expand like the like real time open world elements, where I think about games like Red Dead Redemption 2, where you're encountering NPCs and then getting random side quests as a result of that. Like maybe there's some element of that where in a Spider-Man game or a Ratchet and Clank game, where I think they kind of tried to do more open-ended things with the last one, but it was more like open hubs and spaces. But it would be interesting what does an open-ended game from Insomniac look like, who historically have made like really polished linear experiences?
Yeah, I think obviously Insomniac development kings right now, so I would love to see them tackle that. Um, right now, I'm kind of thinking, I'm like, I kind of want to say 3D Mario, but
Hmm.
I also feel like the most recent Mario Odyssey was open ended to an extent where I was kind of just wandering on these planets and messing around trying to find all these little, they weren't stars, were they? Or moons?
The like
Moons.
crescent moon looking guys, right?
Yeah.
The glow bits.
So I don't know if Mario is one. Honestly, give me like a more open-ended JRPG, like a Final Fantasy or something like that. Like I would love a game where it is kind of like Elden Ringish, where you are dropped in this world of a
Mm-hmm.
Final Fantasy and you're kind of just like exploring instead of the typical. main story, maybe some side stuff, main story, for like a Final Fantasy type project. I was gonna say Gears, but I was like, because Gears kind of dabbles with going a little bit open world in Gears
Especially
5.
Gears 5. Yeah, that one's a
Yeah,
little more in that direction. I think
and
I was
I
thinking about Pokemon. Also, I feel like they're almost
Pokemon,
there, but I would love
yeah,
to see like what does a Breath of the Wild style Pokemon game feel like? And I know Arceus did some elements of that. Scarlet and Violet was more open of an experience, but I want like a really polished Zelda Tears of the Kingdom level Pokemon game that feels like that open.
right, yeah. I think Pokemon would be cool. It's kind of hard because a lot of these games are kind of like halfway there in a
Right.
sense. Like the games that could succeed doing it are kind of like almost there. Um, but yeah, I think maybe taking down some of the barriers that are currently there on like Spider-Man, where it's like very clearly, all right, you're locked in. You have these type of missions. You have, and then you have the main story missions. Spider-Man already kind of does it, where it's like, oh, you walk up onto some crime and you stop it. But I would love it to be a little more organic and less checklisty, where it's like, oh, I go into the Central Park and I could stumble upon a quest where I don't know, Green Goblins running around Central Park or something,
Yeah.
stuff like that. That'd be kind of sweet.
Yeah. That feels like a natural evolution because I think some of these games that feel really rooted in linear, it doesn't feel like they're going to change their structure. It feels like there are certain games where
Yeah.
it's like we are a linear experience, and then there are certain games that are like we're going to get wild with it, which I
Yep.
think there's a place for both. But I do
There
think
is.
it's
Yeah.
interesting to get experimental a little bit with like known franchises and stuff.
Yep. I hope the new Blade game kind of plays around with
Yeah.
that a little more, in terms of like giving you a little more freedom of how you want to tackle things. Like to the conversation we had a little bit earlier about games not AAA games not really leaning into puzzles as much. I think there was a clear distinction between Dishonored 1, 2, and Prey versus Deathloop, where I feel like Deathloop kind of put the training wheels back on a little bit, where it was like, oh yeah, you can like, go through all these loops and find the perfect way to kill all of these, whatever they're called. But ultimately, I felt like I was still kind of doing more or less what they wanted me to do instead of what I thought was the best way to do it. Um, so like having that
Yeah.
open up a little bit more, like in a Deathloop 2 or a Blade would be kind of cool.
Hell yeah. I just want to go play Dishonored. I might go play
So
Dishonored
good,
after
man.
this episode.
So good.
Hell yeah. All right. Any other shout outs, honorable mentions, open ended points of discussion?
Shout out Death's Door. It's not
Mm,
it is more Metroidvania, but once again it is kind of that, oh, you're just kind of exploring the world, and I do feel like especially the end kind of gives you an opportunity to play it how you want and discover things at your own pace and stuff.
yeah. I feel like there's like almost tiers to open endedness where it's like, I think that game is very open ended for what it set out to do, if that makes
Yes.
sense.
Yes.
So, hell yeah. That's a good pick. All right. Well, this was a lot of fun. Good discussion. Highlighted a bunch of games. Now I just want to go play a bunch of games.
Yes.
Joseph, thanks as always for hanging. Do you have anything to plug, anything to shout out? Oh, I want to shout out a recent episode. You did a player episode on rap beef recently.
Oh
And
boy.
as someone who doesn't closely follow hip hop music but enjoys hip hop music, that was a really fun discussion.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Um, so yeah, go listen to that Rap Beef episode on the Player a video game podcast if you want to check that out. Also, Can't Pause on YouTube. Go check out that. Highlight a bunch of indie games. Can'tpause.com as well, where I do written reviews of a bunch of indie games. I should be reviewing uh, Another Crab's Treasure and Animal Well and possibly
Sweet.
Hades 2 soon, if I
Awesome.
can get the time to put together some pieces and some videos. So keep an eye out for that.
Love it. Awesome. And as usual, you can find me. I'm at Lukewarm Lewis on all the socials. You can check out the Lukewarm Games podcast. Our most recent episode is a Fallout Season 1 spoiler cast. Claire and I talk about our time watching the show. And then next episode, we are going to be talking about Little Kitty Big City, the recent indie game. And as cat lovers, we gotta report in on it. So check out our
Okay. Okay.
thoughts in a few weeks. All right. Well, with
Perfect.
that, listeners, I'm going to ask you to do 3 things for us while we set our status to away. If you can follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos, go ahead and send this podcast to a friend because that's how people hear about podcasts. Give us a review on your podcast platform of choice because it really, really does help. And until next time, go off and explore.